They said it would be the end of everything. That's what every mother in Germany believed as the artillery finally stopped that March morning in 1945. In the basement of a shattered apartment building, Frau Kessler held her infant daughter so tightly she could feel the baby's heartbeat through the thin fabric, through the layers of fear that had built up over 12 long years. Above them, the beams groaned like dying animals. Dust fell in streams, catching what little light broke through the cracks in the foundation. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and it wasn't the cold, though the cold was brutal. It was the knowledge that the Americans were coming, and she knew exactly what that meant. Or at least, she thought she did. For over a decade, every radio broadcast, every newspaper, every rally had painted the same terrifying picture. The Americans were coming to destroy them. Not just defeat them, but erase them. Dr. Goebbels himself had screamed it from every speaker in the Reich. The Bolsheviks would bring their Asian hordes from the east, yes. But the Americans, they were something different. They'd come with their jazz music and their chewing gum and their complete contempt for European civilization. They'd reduce Germany to a slave state, defile the women, murder the children, burn everything that remained to ashes. This wasn't speculation or rumor. This was what the Ministry of Propaganda had declared as fact. And Frau Kessler had no reason to doubt it, until she heard the footsteps above her head. The collapse of Nazi Germany wasn't just about losing the war. Anyone with eyes could see the military defeat coming, the Wehrmacht shattered, the Luftwaffe grounded, cities reduced to landscapes of brick and bone. But there was another collapse happening at the same time, something deeper and more devastating than any bombing raid. The entire ideological framework that had held up the Third Reich's claim to superiority was crumbling. For 12 years, the Nazi state had built this elaborate mythology about how weak and degenerate democratic nations were, especially America. They said America was a mongrel nation, weakened by racial mixing, corrupted by Jewish influence, completely incapable of producing soldiers with the martial spirit of Germanic warriors. The propaganda had done its job so thoroughly that by 1945, millions of Germans genuinely believed defeat at American hands would mean total annihilation. What actually happened would shatter those beliefs in ways no Allied bomb ever could. When the 9th Armored Division crossed the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, they did something nobody thought possible. They captured a bridge across the Rhine intact. Within 24 hours, thousands of American troops were pouring into the German heartland, into towns and cities that had lived in terrible suspension for weeks, too far from the front to evacuate, too close to escape what was coming. The people who remained were mostly women, children, and the elderly. The men were dead, captured, or still fighting in units that existed more on paper than in reality. What was left in places like Remagen were the people propaganda had promised to protect, but had instead abandoned to their fate. Frau Kessler heard voices above her. English, American English. She recognized it from the forbidden films she'd watched before the war, before such things became unthinkable. She pulled her daughter closer. The child was silent, too weak from hunger to cry, a mercy that felt like a curse. 3 months earlier, the rations had been cut again. The milk stopped coming. The bread was more sawdust than grain. Her infant had stopped gaining weight in January, and now in March, she felt light as paper in her mother's arms. The footsteps grew closer. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the faces of the dozen women and children huddled in that space. Frau Kessler closed her eyes. This was the moment. This was where all the stories would prove true. The beam stopped on her face. She heard a voice say something in English. Then the light moved away. What happened next stayed with Frau Kessler for the remaining 43 years of her life. The American soldier who descended into that basement was a private named Joseph Hendricks from rural Pennsylvania, 22 years old, a farm boy drafted in 1943 who'd landed on Omaha Beach the previous June. He'd seen the worst of the war, the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the shattered towns of the Rhineland. He'd lost friends to German bullets, German shells, German mines. He had every reason to hate these people. The official line from command was crystal clear. Don't fraternize. Don't trust them. Remember what they did. And yet, when Private Hendricks swept his flashlight across that basement and saw the condition of the civilians huddled there, his first instinct wasn't vengeance. His first instinct was recognition. He saw hunger. He'd grown up during the Depression, knew what it meant to wonder where the next meal would come from. He saw fear, had felt it himself in 100 foxholes across France and Germany. And he saw children, infants and toddlers with hollow eyes and distended bellies, the universal language of starvation that needed no translation. Private Hendricks called up to his sergeant. Within 10 minutes, 3 more Americans had descended into the basement, and they'd brought something Frau Kessler hadn't seen in months. Food. Not German rations, which by March 1945 had become nearly theoretical. Not the bitter ersatz coffee or the gray bread that tasted of chemicals. The Americans brought chocolate bars, condensed milk, white bread, cheese, canned meat. They brought abundance that seemed impossible. Private Hendricks approached Frau Kessler carefully, speaking slow English, holding out a can of condensed milk and gesturing to her child. The woman didn't move. She'd been taught that accepting anything from the enemy was collaboration, maybe even treason. But her daughter was dying, and propaganda can't feed an infant. She took the can. The sergeant, a man named William Kowalski from Detroit, watched this exchange and made a decision that would be repeated thousands of times across Germany in the following weeks. He ordered his men to help evacuate the civilians from the basement to a makeshift aid station the division had established in a partially intact church 3 blocks away. The building was unstable. Another artillery barrage could bring it down any moment. Better to move them now while there was a lull. Private Hendricks reached for Frau Kessler's daughter. The mother recoiled instinctively. The soldier kept his hand extended, palm up, patient. He was smiling, not with triumph, but with something closer to gentleness. Frau Kessler looked at his face, really looked at it, and saw something she hadn't expected to see in an American soldier. Humanity. She placed her daughter in his arms. This moment, this simple transaction of trust, was being replicated across the Western Front with a frequency that startled both the American troops and the German civilians. The mythology of the savage American liberator was colliding with the reality of young men from Iowa and Texas and New York who'd been raised to help neighbors, who instinctively reached for a child in distress, regardless of what uniform the child's mother might have supported. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could these be the monsters Goebbels had warned about? How could these men who carried babies through rubble and shared their rations with enemy civilians be the same soldiers who were supposed to enslave the German people? Private Hendricks carried Frau Kessler's daughter through the ruins of Remagen with the care he might have given his own niece. The child, whose name was Greta, weighed almost nothing. He could feel her ribs through the thin cloth of her dress. Behind him, other GIs were helping elderly women navigate the debris-strewn streets, carrying toddlers on their shoulders, offering arms to those too weak to walk alone. It wasn't an organized humanitarian effort. There were no orders from Eisenhower to prioritize civilian comfort. It was something more instinctive, more fundamentally American. The belief that if you can help, you should help. The transformation this created in the German civilian consciousness was immediate and irreversible. Frau Kessler watched the American soldier carry her daughter to safety, and in that watching, an entire edifice of belief began to crumble. If they'd lied about this, about the nature of the American soldier, what else had they lied about? If these were the enemy, what did that make the people who had promised to protect her and had instead left her to starve in a basement? The scenes at Remagen weren't unique. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany in March and April 1945, they encountered civilian populations in various states of distress. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed not just military targets, but the infrastructure that sustained civilian life. Water systems had collapsed. Food distribution networks had ceased to function. Medical supplies were non-existent. And the Nazi administration, in its final spasmodic throes, had largely abandoned any pretense of caring for the people it claimed to represent. Local Nazi officials fled westward, often in commandeered vehicles, while the civilians they left behind faced the Allied advance with nothing but the propaganda that had sustained them and the growing realization that it had all been lies. The American response to this humanitarian catastrophe wasn't uniform. There were incidents of violence, looting, revenge. War brutalizes everyone it touches, and American soldiers were no exception. But what characterized the American occupation in those first chaotic weeks of spring 1945 wasn't cruelty. It was something closer to confused compassion. The GIs had expected to fight an enemy army. They hadn't expected to find themselves feeding enemy children. In the town of Eschweiler near Aachen, a combat medic named Robert Chen from San Francisco delivered 3 German babies in a single week, working in a basement clinic with whatever medical supplies he could scrounge. In Cologne, engineers from the 8th Infantry Division spent 4 days repairing a water main that served a neighborhood of civilians, work that had nothing to do with military objectives and everything to do with the fact that children were drinking from contaminated puddles. In dozens of small villages across the Rhineland, American mess sergeants found themselves doubling their cooking duties, preparing meals not just for their own troops, but for German civilians who appeared at the perimeter of their camps, silent and starving. This wasn't official policy. The Allied plan for occupied Germany, such as it existed in March 1945, was punitive. The Morgenthau Plan, though eventually rejected, had proposed reducing Germany to a pastoral state, stripping it of industrial capacity, ensuring it could never wage war again. The phrase "no fraternization" was repeated in briefings and printed in field manuals. The Germans had started this war. The Germans had built the camps. The Germans had unleashed horrors upon the world that defied comprehension. They deserved no sympathy, no aid, no kindness. And yet when Private Hendricks carried little Greta Kessler to the aid station and placed her gently in the arms of an army nurse, he wasn't thinking about policy. He was thinking about a child who needed help. When the nurse, a lieutenant named Margaret Sullivan from Boston, examined the infant and found her severely malnourished and dehydrated, she didn't consult the fraternization guidelines. She started an IV, administered glucose, and held the baby while she slept. Lieutenant Sullivan had 5 brothers, all of them in the service. She'd seen what the Germans had done in France, had treated American soldiers with horrific wounds inflicted by German weapons. None of that changed the fact that the child in her arms was dying, and she knew how to save her. Frau Kessler waited outside the church-turned-hospital for 7 hours. She sat on a block of concrete that had once been part of someone's home and stared at nothing. Other German women sat near her, equally silent. They'd been taught to fear this moment, and now they were living it, and it was nothing like what they'd been told. The Americans had given them food. They'd carried their children to safety. They'd shown them something that 12 years of Nazi rule had nearly obliterated: mercy. When Lieutenant Sullivan emerged from the church at dusk, she found Frau Kessler and spoke to her through an interpreter, a German-American sergeant from Milwaukee who'd grown up speaking both languages. The baby would survive, the nurse said. She needed rest and proper nutrition, but she would survive. Frau Kessler began to weep. The interpreter, Sergeant Ernst Miller, had seen this reaction before. German mothers confronted with American kindness and unable to reconcile it with everything they'd been taught. He'd grown weary of explaining that most Americans didn't hate Germans, they hated Nazis, and they understood the two weren't always the same thing. He'd grown weary of being the bridge between two worlds that should never have been at war, but he was patient with Frau Kessler. He told her that her daughter would receive care, that the Americans would provide formula and medicine, that she should rest and try to eat something herself. The woman looked at him with an expression he'd never forget. It wasn't gratitude, though there was gratitude in it. It wasn't relief, though relief was present. It was something closer to fundamental bewilderment, the look of someone whose understanding of the world had just been shattered and who was trying to comprehend what would replace it. The symbolic power of that condensed milk that first can Private Hendricks had offered in the basement can't be overstated. For years, Germans had been told America was a land of poverty and chaos, a failed experiment in democracy where people lived in squalor and racial violence. The reality the Wehrmacht had encountered in France told a different story. The equipment the Americans brought to Europe, the vehicles, the weapons, the supplies, spoke of an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could produce. But it was the small things that truly revealed the gap between propaganda and reality. The chocolate bars that every American soldier seemed to carry, the cigarettes with real tobacco instead of the sawdust substitutes Germans had been smoking, the canned goods, the fresh bread, the coffee that actually tasted like coffee. These weren't luxuries saved for officers. These were standard rations for every private in the American Army. The abundance was staggering. Germany, which had prided itself on efficiency and organization, had been rationing food since 1939 and had been slowly starving its own civilian population to feed its military. America, which the Nazis had dismissed as weak and disorganized, was feeding both its own massive army and increasingly the civilians of its defeated enemy. The contrast couldn't have been sharper, and for Germans who'd believed in the superiority of their system, it was devastating. By late March 1945, the pattern was clear across the American zone of occupation. The 9th Armored Division alone estimated it had provided emergency rations to over 20,000 German civilians in the first 2 weeks after crossing the Rhine. The 1st Infantry Division established feeding stations in Bonn and the surrounding villages, serving hot meals to anyone who appeared. The 3rd Armored Division detailed entire platoons to assist with medical care for civilians, work that took them away from military duties, but which commanders deemed necessary both for humanitarian reasons and for maintaining order. A starving, desperate population was a dangerous population. Better to feed them, the reasoning went, than face an insurgency born of desperation. But the motivation went deeper than pragmatism. The average American GI in Germany in 1945 came from a culture that valorized individual initiative and community responsibility. They'd been raised during the Depression by parents who remembered what it meant to go hungry and who'd survived through a combination of government assistance and neighbors helping neighbors. They'd been taught, consciously or not, that America's strength came not from racial purity or military discipline, but from its diversity, its democratic institutions, and its fundamental belief that people had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These weren't abstract concepts. They were lived values. And when the GIs encountered civilians in distress, these values guided their actions more than any military directive ever could. The German civilians noticed. Of course they noticed. How could they not notice when the behavior of their conquerors contradicted everything they'd been taught about conquest? When German forces had occupied France, Belgium, Poland, the Soviet Union, they hadn't carried children to safety. They'd implemented policies of deliberate starvation, rounded up populations for forced labor or worse, made a philosophy of cruelty. The Americans brought chocolate bars. Frau Kessler wasn't a Nazi. She'd never joined the party, never attended a rally, never raised her arm in salute with any real conviction. She'd been a school teacher before the war, teaching literature and history to children who'd been required to begin each day singing the Horst Wessel Lied. She'd taught the curriculum she was given and kept her doubts to herself, because to voice doubt was to risk everything. Her husband had been drafted in 1942 and sent east. She'd received 3 letters from him, the last one dated November 1943, postmarked from somewhere near Smolensk. After that, silence. She'd raised Greta alone, watched her country destroy itself, and waited for the end everyone knew was coming. When that end arrived in the form of Private Joseph Hendricks from Pennsylvania, it was nothing like she'd imagined. The young soldier who carried her daughter to safety became, in her mind, the symbol of everything the Third Reich had lied about. He wasn't a monster. He was a farm boy who missed his mother and couldn't walk past a suffering child without trying to help. He represented a kind of power Germany had never understood, the power of a nation built on the idea that all people, even your enemies, possessed inherent dignity. This realization spread through the German civilian population like a slow-moving wave throughout spring and summer 1945. As American occupation became daily reality rather than feared prospect, as the predicted atrocities failed to materialize and were replaced instead with feeding programs, medical care, and the slow reconstruction of civil society, the mythology of Nazi superiority collapsed under the weight of observable truth. The Americans weren't perfect occupiers. There were abuses, crimes, failures of policy and implementation. But compared to what Germans had been led to expect, and more damningly compared to what German forces had done in occupied territories, the American presence was marked by a restraint and humanity that made a mockery of 12 years of propaganda. By May, when Germany formally surrendered, Frau Kessler had gained back 15 pounds. Her daughter had tripled her weight and was learning to crawl in the displaced persons center the Americans had established in what had once been a Wehrmacht barracks. The war was over, but the transformation it had wrought in the German consciousness was just beginning. Every German who'd been helped by an American soldier, every child who'd been fed, every mother whose baby had been carried to safety became a witness to the lie they'd been living under. The Reich had promised them greatness and delivered ruin. The Americans, whom they'd been taught to fear and despise, had shown them mercy. The chocolate bar became the symbol of this transformation. It appeared in countless accounts from that period. German children approaching GIs with a mixture of fear and hope. Americans reaching into their pockets to produce the small brown bars with their distinctive wrappers. Hershey's chocolate, that most American of products, became synonymous with liberation in a way no weapon ever could. It represented abundance, yes, but also something deeper, generosity. The Americans didn't need to share their rations with German children. They did it because they chose to, because their culture had taught them this was what decent people did. The contrast with Soviet occupation in Eastern Germany made the American approach even more striking. As the Red Army pushed into Germany from the east, it brought with it justified rage for what the Wehrmacht had done in the Soviet Union. The result was a wave of violence and retribution that German civilians in the Soviet zone experienced with the full horror propaganda had predicted, though for different reasons than Goebbels had claimed. The Americans in the West were different, not because they were morally superior human beings, but because they came from a different culture with different values. The division of Germany into occupation zones created a natural experiment in governance and ideology. In the Soviet sector, occupation was harsh and extractive. Factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. Food was requisitioned. The civilian population lived in fear of Soviet soldiers and administrators alike. In the American sector, by contrast, occupation evolved rapidly from punitive to reconstructive. The GIs who'd carried babies to safety in March were joined by civil affairs officers, reconstruction specialists, and eventually, through the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars in aid designed to rebuild rather than punish. The German civilians in the western zones noticed the difference immediately. Frau Kessler had cousins in Brandenburg in the Soviet zone. The letters that occasionally made it through told stories that made her grateful, despite everything, that the Americans had arrived first. Her cousin Helga wrote of Soviet soldiers who took what they wanted without asking, of a command structure that seemed to view German civilians as legitimate targets for revenge, of a hopelessness that pervaded daily life. In contrast, Frau Kessler could walk to the American mess hall each morning and receive a hot meal. She could take her daughter to the American medical clinic for checkups. She could see with her own eyes American engineers working to restore electricity, to repair roads, to make life livable again. This created a cognitive shift that went beyond mere gratitude. It created a fundamental reorientation toward democracy in the West. Germans in the American zone began to understand their survival and eventual prosperity were linked to the very system they'd been taught to despise. Democracy hadn't made America weak. It had made America strong enough to not only win the war, but to rebuild its enemies afterward. The free market hadn't created chaos. It had created the industrial abundance that now fed German children. Individual liberty hadn't led to social breakdown. It had produced citizens who voluntarily helped those in need, even when those in need were enemy civilians. Private Hendricks wrote home to his parents in Pennsylvania in April 1945, trying to explain what he'd seen and what he'd done. "I carried a German baby to the hospital today," he wrote. "She was starving. Her mother looked at me like she thought I was going to hurt them, but I just wanted to help. I kept thinking about Mary's kids back home. Kids are kids, I guess, no matter what side their parents were on. This whole thing is crazy. We're supposed to hate these people, and I do hate what their army did. But when you see them up close, they're just scared and hungry and tired, just like us, I guess, except they lost and we won. "I'll be glad when I can come home." That letter captured the essential ambivalence of the American occupation. The GIs weren't naive. They knew what the German war machine had done, but they also retained the capacity to see individual Germans as individual humans, a distinction their enemy had systematically failed to make when dealing with occupied populations. This was the fundamental difference between the two systems. One had been built on the belief that some people were inherently superior to others, and thus entitled to brutalize those deemed inferior. The other, for all its flaws and contradictions, maintained at least the aspirational belief that all people possessed equal worth. The impact of this philosophy on German civilians was profound and lasting. Frau Kessler would live until 1988, long enough to see Germany reunified and to watch her daughter raise children of her own in a prosperous, democratic West Germany. In interviews conducted by historians in the 1970s and 1980s, she consistently returned to that moment in March 1945 when Private Hendricks had reached for her daughter. "That was when I knew it was all lies," she said. "Everything they'd told us, everything we'd believed, lies. The Americans were supposed to be our enemies, and they saved my child's life. What does that make the people who told us to fear them?" This was the question that haunted Germany in the aftermath of the war. The physical reconstruction was difficult enough. Cities had to be rebuilt, the economy revived, the population fed and housed. But the psychological reconstruction was perhaps even more challenging. An entire nation had to come to terms with the fact they'd been systematically lied to, that they'd supported a regime built on hatred and lies, and that their supposed enemies had shown them more humanity in defeat than their own leaders had shown them in victory. The American soldiers who participated in these small acts of mercy in spring 1945 didn't think of themselves as agents of ideological transformation. They were just doing what seemed right in the moment. But collectively, these actions, the carrying of babies, the sharing of food, the provision of medical care, accomplished what no amount of propaganda or re-education programs could achieve. They demonstrated in practical, undeniable ways the difference between a system built on human dignity and a system built on human degradation. The process of denazification, the formal Allied program to remove Nazi ideology from German society, was often heavy-handed and imperfect. Questionnaires were filled out, party members identified and sometimes prosecuted, symbols banned and monuments destroyed. But the real denazification happened in moments like the one Frau Kessler experienced in that basement. It happened when observable reality contradicted propaganda so thoroughly that the propaganda simply collapsed. It happened when a German mother placed her dying child in the arms of an American soldier and discovered that mercy was real, that kindness existed even in war, that the enemy was human after all. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or universal. Some Germans retreated into bitter nostalgia for the Reich, refusing to accept responsibility for what had been done in their name. Some clung to anti-Semitism and hatred even as their cities were rebuilt with American assistance. But for millions of Germans, particularly those who had direct contact with American forces in those early months of occupation, the change was undeniable. They'd seen with their own eyes that democracy worked, that diversity created strength rather than weakness, that a nation built on individual liberty could be more powerful, more prosperous, and more humane than any authoritarian state. By summer, American military government had established formal programs to address the humanitarian crisis in occupied Germany. The army began distributing food on a systematic basis, established hospitals, and started the long process of rebuilding infrastructure. But these official programs were built on the foundation of those first spontaneous acts of compassion in March and April. The German civilians who lined up for American rations in June had already been softened by the experiences of March. They'd already learned Americans could be trusted, that the democracy they represented offered something more substantial than the authoritarianism that had promised them greatness and delivered catastrophe. The milk that Lieutenant Sullivan used to save little Greta's life came from Wisconsin dairy farms, processed in American factories, shipped across the Atlantic in American merchant vessels protected by American warships. It represented a supply chain of staggering sophistication and industrial and logistical capacity that Germany, even at the height of its power, had never possessed. But more than that, it represented a choice. America could have let German children starve. Some argued they should. Instead, American taxpayers funded the shipment of millions of tons of food and medical supplies to feed the people whose army had just spent 6 years trying to destroy civilization. This wasn't weakness. This wasn't naivety. This was power. The power of a nation secure enough in its values to show mercy to its defeated enemies, confident those values would ultimately prove more durable than any military victory. The Nazi system had been built on the idea that might makes right, that the strong were entitled to dominate the weak. The American response to German defeat was a reputation of that philosophy. It said quietly but firmly that strength should be used to protect, not destroy. That victory imposed obligations, not just opportunities, that the true measure of civilization was how it treated those who couldn't defend themselves. Frau Kessler understood this, though she might not have articulated it in these terms, as she held her daughter in the Displaced Persons Center in summer 1945, as she listened to American jazz playing on a GI's radio and ate American white bread that tasted like a miracle after years of ersatz rations. She understood something fundamental had changed. The world she'd known, the world of the Reich and its promises of greatness, was gone forever. What would replace it was still uncertain. But if the Americans were any indication, it would be built on different principles. It would be built on the idea that a soldier could carry an enemy's child to safety. And this wasn't a betrayal of his duty, but an expression of it. The summer of 1945 brought its own challenges. The war in Europe had ended, but millions of displaced persons clogged the roads and railways, searching for homes that no longer existed or family members who hadn't survived. American occupation forces found themselves administering a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. But the foundation of trust that had been established in those first weeks proved invaluable. German civilians cooperated with American authorities because they'd learned cooperation led to aid, not punishment. They registered with occupation officials because they'd learned Americans could be trusted to treat them fairly. They began the long, painful process of confronting what had been done in their name because they'd seen firsthand that another way was possible. Greta Kessler would grow up with no memory of that March day when an American soldier had carried her to safety. But the story was told to her repeatedly throughout her childhood, became part of her family's mythology, shaped her understanding of the world. She'd become a teacher, like her mother, would raise 2 sons in the Federal Republic of Germany, would live to see the Berlin Wall fall and Germany reunite. And she'd tell her students about the day she was saved, about the soldier from Pennsylvania who'd shown mercy when he had every reason not to, about the lesson that moment taught, that civilization is fragile, that cruelty is easy, but that kindness requires courage, and that courage can change the world. The epilogue to this story played out over decades. West Germany became a democracy, a close ally of the United States, an economic powerhouse rebuilt with American assistance through the Marshall Plan. The generation that had lived through 1945, that had experienced the collapse of the Nazi state and the unexpected mercy of the American occupation, became the generation that built the new Germany. They remembered. They taught their children to remember not just the horrors of what they'd supported, consciously or through silence, but also the lesson of what real strength looked like when exercised with restraint and guided by values. Private Joseph Hendricks returned to Pennsylvania in December 1945. He went back to farming, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he didn't talk about the battles or the fear or the friends he'd lost. He talked about the German mother in the basement and her baby who'd weighed nothing at all. He talked about how strange it had been to be feared and then trusted, how much it had meant to see that child survive. In 1982, a German documentary crew tracked him down, working from Frau Kessler's memories and American unit records. They asked him why he'd helped. He looked confused by the question. "What else was I supposed to do?" he said. "She was a baby. You help babies." That answer, in its simplicity, captured something essential about the American character that Nazi ideology had never understood. The Reich had believed democracy made people weak, that diversity made societies unstable, that mercy was a luxury only the powerful could afford. Private Hendricks proved them wrong. He wasn't weak. He'd survived Omaha Beach, had fought through France and Germany against an enemy that gave no quarter. But he'd retained the capacity for compassion, the instinct to help rather than harm. That wasn't weakness. That was strength of a kind the Third Reich had never comprehended. The babies carried to safety in spring 1945 grew up in a Germany transformed. They became doctors and teachers, builders and artists, mothers and fathers themselves. They lived in a country that had learned through the most catastrophic failure imaginable that authoritarianism led only to destruction, and that democracy, for all its messiness and contradictions, offered something better. The possibility of dignity, the promise of choice, the hope that mercy might triumph over cruelty. And when they told their own children and grandchildren about the war, some of them told the story of the American soldiers who'd carried them to safety, who'd given their mothers food and medicine, who'd shown them the world didn't have to be built on hatred. These stories became part of the fabric of German memory, a counterweight to the shame and horror of what the Reich had done. They weren't excuses. Nothing could excuse the Holocaust, the aggressive wars, the deliberate cruelty of the Nazi state. But they were reminders that even in humanity's darkest hours, even in the ruins of a civilization that had chosen evil, small acts of decency remained possible. And sometimes those small acts, a soldier carrying a baby through rubble, a nurse saving a child's life, a can of condensed milk offered without demand for payment or gratitude, could plant seeds of something better. The mothers who wept in spring 1945 wept for many reasons. They wept for what they'd lost: husbands, homes, the illusion of righteousness. They wept for what they'd learned, that they'd been deceived, that the enemy wasn't who they'd been told. They wept from relief their children would survive, and from shame that it had taken conquest to teach them what their own government had tried to destroy. that mercy wasn't weakness, that diversity wasn't degradation, that the measure of civilization was how you treated those who had no power to demand better treatment. In the end, the story of German mothers weeping as American soldiers carried their babies to safety isn't a story about American virtue or German wickedness. It's a story about the collision of two systems, one built on the belief that some humans were inherently superior to others, and one built on the aspiration, however imperfectly realized, that all humans possessed equal dignity. When those systems met in the ruins of Germany in 1945, the outcome was never really in doubt. The question was only how much destruction would occur before the lesson was learned. The babies survived, most of them anyway. They grew up in the shadow of their parents' choices and their nation's crimes. But they also grew up in a world where an American soldier had once stopped in the middle of a war to help a child who wasn't his own, who belonged to a nation he had every reason to hate. That memory, repeated thousands of times across Germany in spring 1945, became a foundation not for forgetting what had happened, that could never be forgotten, but for building something different, something better. The chocolate bars and condensed milk are long gone. The soldiers who distributed them are mostly gone too, their generation passing into history. But what they represented remains. The idea that abundance should be shared, that power should be exercised with restraint, that even your enemy's children deserve compassion. These weren't uniquely American values, but America in that moment chose to embody them. And in doing so, it won a victory more lasting than any military conquest. It won the peace. It won the future. It proved that democracy, for all its flaws, offered something authoritarianism could never provide: the freedom to choose mercy over cruelty, generosity over revenge, hope over despair. Frau Kessler died believing her daughter had been saved by an act of grace in a graceless time. She was right. But the grace wasn't miraculous or divine. It was human, which made it all the more remarkable. In spring 1945, in the ruins of a failed empire, young men from a distant democracy carried babies to safety because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, they demonstrated a truth 12 years of Nazi propaganda couldn't erase: that the strength of a nation lies not in its capacity for violence, but in its commitment to human dignity, not in its ability to dominate, but in its willingness to lift up even those who'd fallen furthest. That's what the mothers wept for in the end, not just for their children's survival, but for the recognition of what survival meant. It meant the world they'd known was gone, but the world to come might be built on better foundations. It meant mercy was real, that kindness was possible, that even in the midst of total war, humanity could reassert itself. It meant democracy wasn't weakness, but strength, that diversity wasn't decay, but renewal, that the future belonged not to those who preached hatred, but to those who practiced compassion. The babies carried to safety became the builders of that future, and the soldiers who carried them went home, having changed the world one small act of mercy at a time,